Good morning. It's good to see everyone. Sorry about the muffled sound. Thank you all for being here for our Psalm study, and welcome to those as well who are watching on the live stream. We are here in our, third or fourth official class. Third official class. We're already 2 weeks behind, so yay me. So, the material that we're covering is going to be a little bit behind on the syllabus. But we are going to try to stay caught up with the planned reading. So the reading schedule on one side of the syllabus, we'll continue to stick to those dates, but we won't necessarily always be caught up on the syllabus side. But Scott has assured me that I might have a flex week or two at the end if I need it. So hopefully we'll be able to get through everything. Well, as those of you who've been here the first couple weeks know, I like to put you to work at the beginning of class. So let's review, shall we, the structure of the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is divided into 5 sub-books, much like the books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And we talked about that parallel between the instruction of Moses, the law of Moses, and the instruction of the Lord that we find in the book of Psalms. But let's review what the division points are in the book of Psalms. Book 1 is Psalms 1 through... I sense some hesitation in the group. Somebody say it confidently. 41. Book 2 is Psalm 42 through 72. Book 3, Psalm 73 through 89. Book 4 then is Psalm 90 through 106. Good. And so then book 5, 107 through 150. So we did pretty well this week. So keep reviewing that. As I mentioned, these divisions are usually right there in your Bibles, printed between the Psalms. So you can practice during the week as you do your psalm reading. We had a new chapter in the Longman book to read. So thanks to those of you who have purchased that book and been reading through it. I'm delighted to report that there are only 2 books unclaimed. So if you haven't been able to pick up one of those books, then you have a couple more chances to do so. But we were to read chapter 1, which has to do with the genres of the Psalms. Now, genres is a fancy French-sounding word, but it has a pretty basic meaning. So the first thing we could review from that chapter is, what is a genre? Anybody get an idea of that from the reading? A tractor? Okay. John Deere. A group of texts. Okay. So now, with the same subject matter, Ralph says. Any other ideas? What is a genre? A category. I heard another word too. Oh, texts similar in their mood. So here we're talking about something besides just subject matter, and that's exactly right. So the author of this chapter talks about how a genre of text is a group of texts that are associated not just because they're talking about the same thing, but how they talk about the same thing. They have a similar mood, they have a similar form, Sometimes they have a similar style or tone. For instance, looking outside the Bible, we would call a newspaper article a genre that is very different from a Romantic era poem that is in turn very different from an academic essay or from a research report or from government legislation. In other words, we as readers bring a different set of expectations about that text when we come to it. We don't come to a piece of government legislation expecting to find a punchline at the end, although maybe some people think so. We don't come to a academic article expecting it to rhyme. We don't come to a newspaper article, and for you people under 30, a newspaper is something people used to get thrown onto their doorstep in the morning and they'd read it while they were drinking their coffee. Anyway, so you don't read a newspaper article and expect to find a discourse on the meaning of life. So in other words, there are different kinds of texts, and we bring different kinds of expectations to those texts, and if we bring the wrong set of expectations, we can interpret the text very incorrectly. So this author is helping guide us through the book of Psalms, telling us not only that are the Psalms together a different kind of genre than, say, the laws of Moses or the histories or the Gospels. That's true. But even within the Psalms, there are different kinds of Psalms, different genres of Psalms. And we have to be aware of the similarities and differences between these Psalms. So here's where I'm going to test your memory, unless you're cheating and looking in the book right now. Do you remember any of the types of genre or the categories of the Psalms that the author discussed? Hymns, laments, wisdom, praise, thanksgiving, remembrance, good, kingship or royal psalms. Any others? Confidence or trust, or sometimes they're called. So these are artificial categories. God didn't give these names to us. These are things that people have sort of agreed upon are good categories. Let's see how many we got just from that. So a hymn, a lament or a complaint psalm, thanksgiving, remembrance, confidence or trust, wisdom, royal or kingship. 3, 4, 5. Is that all? Oh, that's all there is. Okay, so this author comes up with at least 7 categories of psalms, meaning there's a lot of variety in this book. And it's not necessarily neatly broken down by section. In other words, it's not like book 1 of the Psalms only has confidence psalms and book 2 only has kingship psalms. They're scattered together, and so there can be a little bit of whiplash as you read the book of Psalms if you're not paying attention to this sort of thing. In other words, one psalm can be talking about one thing in a very specific way, and the very next psalm can be talking about it in the opposite way. Good. Even in the same psalm, Jerry says, you can almost have a switch in genre. That's an excellent point as well. So there's endless variety in these types of psalms. And so I would invite us to view this variety as a smorgasbord, as a cornucopia of all of the range of human emotion that God allows us and encourages us to experience. Rather than finding it bewildering, we should find it inviting. There is something here for everyone in every season of life. So that is one of the beauties, the beautiful variety of the Psalms. So I hope that was a helpful chapter. Did you have any comments or questions based on your reading of that chapter, if you had a chance to read it? Crystal clear? Oh, Aaron? Yeah.
approach that. So I like that idea of strategy, because I don't often approach my reading with strategy.
Yeah. So Aaron brings out this point that knowing these kinds of categories for the Psalms can inform our reading strategy for the Psalms. And he made the point that we don't always think about having a strategy or a plan when we go into reading Scripture, but that in fact can be helpful. Now, we have to hold that plan lightly because genres are man-made categories. And he says that right at the end of the chapter. These are flexible. So it's not, as Jerry said, sometimes one psalm seems to have a little bit of both. But it still is helpful to have a little bit of a plan and some expectations, because good expectations can produce often better interpretations, better readings. I'll give you a negative example from my own experience, not with Scripture. About 15 years ago, I had a bunch of friends who said, "You've got to go see this new movie that's come out. It's great. It's one of the best movies I've ever seen. It's called Napoleon Dynamite." And I knew nothing about this movie. It had the word Napoleon in it. I assumed it was some kind of history film, maybe even some kind of war film. Dynamite certainly sounded violent and military. I knew nothing. Imagine my surprise when the movie is about some weird Mormons in Idaho and school popularity and tater tots and chickens with large talons. I had a completely wrong set of expectations that I brought into the movie, and it completely bewildered me at first. I didn't know what to make of what I was seeing and hearing. Well, there's a kind of parallel between that to what we're talking about here. As Aaron said, it can help to have some pre-understanding of what's going on in Scripture before we enter it. So these genres are not hard and fast categories. You could come up with a different set. In fact, there are some people who say there's only two types of psalms. There is the hymn and there is the lament, and that all this variety can be categorized under one or the other. I think that's a bit reductionist, but the point is we can come up with a different category. It doesn't matter so much what you call these as you understand that there is a lot of variety in the Psalms, and that variety is there for a reason, that God is expressing himself through a wide variety of style and category and forms. I don't want to belabor this point, but it really is so crucial to understanding what's going on in the Psalms, and that there is so much variety from one psalm to the next. And if you've been keeping up with the Bible reading, I'm sure that you've encountered that at this point. All right, good. Any other comments, reactions, questions about the reading? Okay, great. Well, let's continue with the material that we left off with last Sunday. One thing that we want to talk about as we orient ourselves to the book of Psalms is what kind of worldview does this book of Scripture have? In other words, how does it envision what's going on in the world, and how does it form us in our worldview? Remember that I mentioned last week that there's a kind of triangle going on in the book of Psalms. That it's a triangle with God at the top, Israel at one corner, and the nations of the world in the other corner. Excuse me. Is there a water bottle anybody could fetch me? Thank you, Scott. And God is not only concerned with his chosen people, he is concerned with the nations as well. We saw that in Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? Well, one thing to understand about the Psalms and about Israel is that Israel was both similar to and distinct from the nations around it. Thank you.
Israel is both distinct from and similar to the nations around it.
And so the Psalms of Israel are going to be both similar in their worldview to the kinds of literature that we see in the surrounding ancient world and distinct from it.
Really sorry for those who are on the headsets or the live stream who are getting my coughs right in their ears. This is from a Christian scholar of the Old Testament named John Walton. He does a lot of work in what were ancient people's views of the universe, views of the world. What did they think? What did they think the world was shaped like? What did they think was going on in the broader world, in the universe? And he calls this the ancient world's cosmic geography. He says, cosmic geography concerns how people envision the shape and structure of the world around them. In the ancient world, they also had a cosmic geography that was just as intrinsic to their thinking, just as fundamental to their worldview, and just as true in their minds as ours. So just as a vast majority of Americans think that the world is round, and that it goes around the sun, that we're part of a solar system with 8 or 9 planets in it, depending on who you ask, and that that's in a galaxy called the Milky Way. They were just as sure about their view of the universe. And it differs from ours at every point. Not able to advance here. Thank you. So, Walton continues, from a political standpoint, it was commonplace for peoples of any area, including Israel, to see themselves and their land or their capital city as the center of the earth. In cosmic terms, the center of the earth was often conceived of either in terms of a world tree, a tree that all of the universe kind of grows upon, or a cosmic mountain. So, this is very commonplace, and you see this in a lot of ancient literatures, that the king lives in a palace, in a city that is the center of the world. And we may not literally believe that, but we all kind of act like that sometimes, right? We often say that. You think you're the center of the universe. But many people lived and believed and acted as though that were true in the ancient world, that the universe looked maybe different in their imagination. Maybe it wouldn't have been a sphere, but would have been something. And very often it was pictured as either a mountain or a tree that was at the center of the world, and that's where their king ruled from, that's where their gods ruled from. And various artists have envisioned this in different ways. But here's one thing that I think is really interesting. As we go back to Psalms 1 and 2, which we just studied last week, could you advance again? I want you to notice how both of these ideas of a tree and a mountain are there right at the beginning of the book of Psalms. Remember how the book of Psalms begins in Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the way of the wicked, he doesn't stand in the way of sinners, he doesn't sit in the seat of scoffers. His delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. But what is next in verse 3? He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. In other words, the first poetic image that we get in the book of Psalms is of a firmly planted tree. And this tree, this fruitful tree that prospers, that doesn't wither, it's rooted not in the power of a certain ancient king, not in a certain army, not in a certain political structure. It's anchored, it is rooted in the instruction of the Lord, in the law of Yahweh, Israel's God. That, in a sense, is the center of the universe. That is what makes the world go round, is
the instruction, the teaching, the words of the Lord that we find not only in the law of Moses, but here in the Psalms. This is a source of life. It is the place to go if you want to flourish. That's a bold claim, especially in the context of claims that other ancient empires would have made. And notice, in the very next psalm, which is also part of the introduction to the Psalms, the image shifts from a tree to a mountain. So in Psalm 2, remember we just read this, why did the nations rage against the Lord and against his anointed? Well, in verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, which is a name for a hill in Jerusalem, my holy hill. So in response to all the world empires mocking God, raging against God, murmuring against God, the Lord simply laughs and says, this is the true center of power in the universe. Zion, an insignificant hill in the hill country of Judah, a backwater country in the Mediterranean. That is the center of the world. I have set up a king, David and his descendants, on the throne in Jerusalem, and that is the place from which I, the Lord, order the world. And all the nations are going to have to deal with that. They're going to have to reckon with that in some way. Ask of me, verse 8 says, and I will make the nations your heritage, David, and the ends of the earth your possession. Verse 10, now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling, kiss the Son, that is David, the Davidic king, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Functionally speaking, Psalm 2 claims, the world is centered on the mountain in Jerusalem where the Davidic king dwells and reigns with the Lord's approval. Both Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 make claims that run completely opposite to what many of the nations around would have claimed. That they were the center of the world, that their army was the most powerful force, that their empire would last forever. And the book of Psalms immediately tells us with this image of a tree, a firmly planted tree, and of a high mountain in Jerusalem, that these are the center of the universe. The secret to success and prosperity and flourishing and eternal life go through this tiny little backwater kingdom in the hill country of Judah. That's an astonishing claim, especially given the realities on the ground. Israel and Judah were a tiny group of people, a tiny nation, surrounded by Babylonians and Egyptians and Assyrians and Persians and Hittites and so many other more powerful nations from a military standpoint. But the book of Psalms reminds us that not all is as it seems. The true source of life and power and flourishing and well-being go through the law and the anointed of the Lord. I don't think we can skip past this point too quickly, because for those of us who are Christians, the foundation of our belief system runs through this same truth. That the Davidic king mentioned here in the Psalms is ultimately pointing to Jesus. And we make the similarly radical claim that the source of happiness and well-being and life runs through a carpenter's son from a backwater village in Israel. And that despite all the other wealth and pomp and power that you can find in the ancient or modern world, all the other metrics of success, that none of those compare to what he can offer us. And that all nations will have to kiss the Son and do homage to him. That is a radical claim. It is a completely radical worldview. It reforms the world around what God is doing through Israel and David's seed, Jesus. So the Psalms help reorient us from the way that things appear to be in our outside world. Things appear to be going one way, but things are actually going a much different way, the Psalms tell us. And so one benefit of immersing ourselves in the Psalms is reminding ourselves that God is reforming, recreating the world around David's son. David's son in Zion. And for us as Christians, ultimately, we can't affirm that without saying that's Jesus. Check my time here. So as we think about these genres of Psalms, as we discussed in our reading, another way of thinking about the variety that we find in the Psalms is to think about how do the Psalms help change our frame of mind. Our minds are inclined to go the way of the world, to think that success looks a certain way, to think that happiness looks a certain way, to think that well-being looks a certain way. In America, we're particularly disposed to think of the American way as a metric of success. Individual achievement, hard work, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, as we sometimes say. The Psalms orient us to a different reality, a reality that comes through the Davidic king and the law of the Lord. And there are, as one Old Testament scholar, Walter Brueggemann, has suggested, 3 types of Psalms. This is a different kind of category than what we saw in the Longman chapter. And he calls these Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and Psalms of reorientation. I think this is a useful scheme for looking at the Psalms. It gives us, as Aaron was saying, a reading strategy for encountering some of these Psalms. And basically his point is this. There are certain Psalms that suggest that all is well with the world. And it is, if things are pretty much going well for us, those can be very orienting kinds of Psalms. They help us see things as they ought to be. But there are other Psalms that are designed to do, in fact, just the opposite. They are designed to make our head spin. Or they come out of the experience of someone whose world has just been shattered. And they bring this disorientation to the Lord, because where else would they bring it? But they say that despite the promises of God, despite the way that the world ought to be for God's people, things are not working out that way. And by now I'm sure you've encountered many of these Psalms, many of which would be classified as lament or complaint Psalms. And then there are other Psalms, and I think these get to the ones that Jerry was alluding to earlier, ones that seem to almost have a shift in the middle of them. They start out one way and they end another way. There are Psalms that can help reorient us through that pain of disorientation, through the suffering of life, and say, even in spite of such things, I can trust the Lord and I will give thanks to the Lord. So, this scheme of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation is maybe a helpful way of thinking about how the Psalms can impact our spiritual lives to help refocus us on the things that are truly important, the instruction of the Lord and the reign of his Son. So, I have suggested from the first few Psalms in Book 1, some psalms that kind of fit those, at least those first two categories. So we've already discussed Psalm 1 and 2 in some depth. Let's consider for a moment the psalms that come next, Psalms 3 through 7. Obviously, we can't go through each of those, but we can at least see what kinds of psalms they are. Armed with the knowledge we got from our reading from the study guide, I think we can quickly identify what types of psalms these are. So we're going to do a very quick overview of Psalms 3 through 7. If you have your Bible or Bible app, go ahead and open that to book 1 of the Psalms, and let's just read a couple verses from especially the beginnings of these Psalms. Notice that beginning in Psalm 3, we're now dealing with Psalms that have a header at the top, or a superscription. We talked about those last week. Many of them say a Psalm of David. Some of them connect to certain events in David's life. Psalm 3, a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Talk about a disorienting experience when you have to flee from your own flesh and blood. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. The end of that verse has a little word, S-E-L-A-H. It's just a Hebrew word, and it's printed there because nobody has any idea what it means. Your guess is as good as mine. But what kind of sentiment is expressed there in the first couple verses of Psalm 3? Lament, good. Distress, good. That's a good word for it. Yeah. So,
It's not just like a physical attack. There's some kind of like an attack mental.
yeah, great. So if you didn't hear that, Aaron was saying one thing that's so distressing about these first two verses is not just that the psalmist has enemies. Many of us have people with whom we come into sharp conflict, but they're not just attacking sort of his physical well-being. They are attacking his whole spiritual being, saying, you don't have help from God. So this is an all-encompassing kind of crisis. Look at Psalm 4, first couple verses. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? This is a really interesting introduction to this psalm. It's a little bit different than Psalm 3. How would you describe what's going on in these first two verses of Psalm 4? Okay, so maybe some loneliness. Who is addressed in these first two verses? Okay, so there's a personal address from David to God, but that's in verse 1. What about verse 2? Who is addressed? Yeah, so in other words, the psalm shifts from complaint toward God to complaint towards fellow humans. So this gives us another insight into what the Psalms can do. They can give voice not only to the things that we feel toward God, but also to the things that we feel towards our fellow man. And it seems that those two distresses that the psalmist is going through, whatever they are related. That what he wants God to answer him about is also connected to what he wants his fellow man to be answering him about. And notice the question that he asks his fellow men. It's one that will come up constantly in the Psalms. And I hope you'll get really familiar at spotting it. How long? This is the cry of the psalmist throughout the book of Psalms. It's addressed to God, it's addressed to fellow man, but the question is, how long? What is bound up in that question? What are we feeling when we ask a question like that? How long? Tired. Weariness. Frustration. Impatience. Impatience with God and impatience with our fellow human beings is such an essential component of the human condition, isn't it? We are used to being let down, and we're used to having to wait for that which we seek. How long? Psalm 5. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you do I pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. So again, we begin with an address to the Lord. That's an important point not to overlook, that whatever the situation is the psalmist is dealing with, he still addresses it to the Lord. But what is he specifically asking God for in these introductory verses? Hear him. Pay attention to me, God. Can you relate with that? Pay attention to me. This isn't just loneliness. This is implicitly saying, I don't think I'm actually being seen. I don't think what I'm going through as a person is being acknowledged. Not just by my fellow man, but by my Creator. That's a pretty foundational kind of lament. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we feel that sometimes. That who I am, my entire person with my needs and my fears and my hopes and my talents and my wishes and my frustrations and my regrets, that's a lot. And I just often don't feel like I'm being seen as a person. I'm being seen for who I am and what I need. There's a dehumanizing quality when you don't feel that you are being paid attention to. CJ? Yeah, it's like being disconnected. Excellent. So this disconnect between the psalmist's belief and the psalmist's experience is what characterizes so many of the lament psalms. It's a good word for it. Psalm 6. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. My soul also is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? We've already seen that addressed to fellow man in a previous psalm. Now that question, that cry of the soul, how long, is addressed to who? To the Lord himself. So what is the psalmist experiencing in this psalm? It's a little bit different, isn't it, from what we've seen in the previous psalms? Very possibly depression is what we would, as moderns, describe this as. Languishing. Weariness. Disconnect from God, Mark says. What's different about verse 1? What is the request that's made in verse 1 of Psalm 6? Did I hear it over here? Yeah, this is really interesting. There's a couple ways we could take this, I think. Don't rebuke me in your anger. Is this saying don't rebuke me at all? Or is it saying don't rebuke me while you're angry? I know that, sometimes kids make that second kind of request to their parents, right? Please don't discipline me while you're angry. Let's talk about this once you've cooled off a little bit. But isn't that interesting coming from the psalmist to God? Don't rebuke me or discipline me while you're angry. But instead, what is the request in verse 2? Be gracious, and that's parallel with, so yeah, my translation says, heal me in the second part of the verse. Be gracious or merciful and heal me. So in contrast to what he's experiencing, whatever it is the Lord's discipline, the Lord's chastening, the Lord's rebuke. What he feels that he needs is grace, mercy, healing. And the language of the Psalms, it's not just that my emotions are hurt, my bones are troubled. He feels this in his bones, and the psalmist will very often describe their spiritual anguish in physical terms, which again just reminds us that we are not disembodied spirits. We are infleshed people, and that, as they say, depression hurts, right? Like it affects your whole being. And notice that he can't even finish the request. He can't even finish the sentence there at the end of verse 3. But you, O Lord, how long? That's what we would call in English class a sentence fragment, right? But it shows the desperation and how hard it is to articulate what the psalmist is going through. He maybe expected humans to disappoint him, but maybe he never expected this from God. How long? Psalm 7, as we begin to wrap up here. O Lord my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart, rending it in pieces with none to deliver. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is wrong in my hands, if I have repaid my friend with evil or plundered my enemy without cause, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it, and let him trample my life to the ground and lay my glory in the dust. So what is the psalmist feeling in this psalm? This is a little bit more complicated, I think. Confusion? Good. Okay, that's really well put. Wrongly accused. Because the psalmist seems to suggest, I think I've been doing the right thing. I've been trying to take refuge in you. And remember how that language of taking refuge harks back to the end of Psalm 2. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. That's a promise. Well, the psalmist says, I think I've been doing that, but it's not working out so great for me. In other words, there is a disconnect between the psalmist's belief and the psalmist's experience in reality. And the Psalms are honest that this can be the case, that we can feel that even when we are doing the right thing, we are not being rewarded for it. Okay, well, we're running out of time here, but this scheme of, there are not only Psalms of orientation, there are also Psalms of disorientation that express this feeling of disconnectedness, lostness, depression, anguish. And it's important to acknowledge these and not to run past them to the hymns, to the praises. That this too is part of what it means to be a child of God, to experience these valleys as well as the peaks. Okay, we're going to save that for next time. So, I would encourage you, as you continue through your reading of the Psalms, to live in these moments of lament that we find scattered throughout the Psalms. Not to skim over them, but to allow them to plumb the depths of what's going on in your own heart. Because as Psalm 23, which is coming up, reminds us, God doesn't just pick us up and let us hop over the valleys. He still makes us go through the valley, but he'll be there with us. And that's what these Psalms of Lament are ultimately helping us to realize. All right, well, thank you for your time, for your comments. We're going to pick up there next week. So try to keep up with the Psalm reading schedule, but we're going to try to pick up with Psalm 8 next time.